This video is part of the PMD Pro 2 series on the project management tools. This session is on the topic of assumptions, especially how the last column in the log frame can be better used as a tool in project management. These sessions are designed for participants who've completed the Project Management for Development Professionals Level 1 course, the examination, and are studying for PMD Pro Level 2. The emphasis is being made in this series on project management tools, and it's to assist with the use of those tools and to promote transfer of learning with the intention of improving performance and contributions that can be made toward higher level impacts, especially in the humanitarian sector. I'll start with an easy review question. At what point in the PMD Pro phase model do we begin to look at and try to understand assumptions? I hope this is an easy question for most of you because assumptions are a critical part of the logical framework or log frame, which is done first as part of the proposal in project identification and design phase. There are also relationships between assumptions and the other phases, but this video is going to concentrate on the log frame as a tool for project management. Too often, especially among organizations in the NGO community, assumptions are written and then forgotten. This is unfortunate as assumptions can serve some very useful purposes. Some like to say that the assumptions are the crux of the log frame. Crux may be a new word to some of you. I looked it up, and the definition is at the bottom of the slide. Crux is derived from the Latin word meaning cross. It is a vital, basic, decisive, or pivotal point. So we're saying in PMD Pro that assumptions are a vital, basic, decisive, and pivotal point of the log frame. Now that's contrary, as I said, to how most people use assumptions in the log frame. A lot of times assumptions are thrown in at the very end of the log frame preparation just to be compliant with what has to go into a log frame. But as you read the log frame logically, here's what you'll do. You say if the outputs are achieved and the assumptions hold true, then they will significantly contribute to the outcomes. In project management, we are especially concerned about the tangible changes at the output level and below, particularly where this cell has been highlighted on this slide. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about the overall logic of the log frame, especially how assumptions are used to complete the logic of the hierarchy of objectives. This column gives descriptions of the goals, outcomes, outputs, and activities, and it is a hierarchy of objectives or a description of the intervention. It has logic that you can read from the bottom up to the top or from the top down, from the top to bottom. It's also called the vertical logic. If you accomplish these objectives at the activity level, they will produce the outputs. If the outputs are produced, they will contribute to the outcomes. If the outcomes are produced, they contribute to the goal. However, what I've just described is not a complete logic. And to repeat for emphasis, the vertical logic is essential, but it's not complete. You have to add the positive assumption statements in order to make complete logical reading of the log frame. That requires what PMD Pro calls the horizontal logic component, so that the overall logic reads like this. And note that I'm starting at the output level because that's probably the most important level for practical assumptions for use in project management. Outcomes are also extremely important to project management, but we are mostly and very much concerned about the tangible products and services. So if you produce the outputs and the assumption statements at the output level hold true, then the project will contribute significantly to accomplishment of the outcomes. If the outcomes are accomplished and the assumptions at the outcome level hold true, then the project will significantly contribute toward the project goal. So the combination of the vertical horizontal logic and the horizontal logic completes the logic of the log frame. I hope I've made this clear and that you know that assumptions are extremely important. Let me back up a bit and ask you this question. What is an assumption? Look at the alternatives on this slide and select the correct answer. Is an assumption A something that's accepted as true? B, arrogance? C, part of the cause-effect relationship? D, expecting planned activities to produce results. I'll pause while you think about the possible answers. I'm going to provide answers and say a bit about all four of these possibilities, A, B, C, and D. First of all, A is correct. An assumption is something that someone assumes is going to happen or to be maintained in order to accomplish at one level what is needed to contribute to the next higher level. So, assumptions are positive statements of conditions that are accepted as correct using the best estimation available at the time of preparing a log frame, of course. In B, you can see I'm attempting to confuse you. You may have assumed that there's only one right answer to this question, but there isn't. I believe an assumption can also be a sign of arrogance. Now, we hope that those who are preparing log frames can keep arrogance to a minimum, but sometimes our assumptions can really get us in trouble because we're not being realistic, or we're thinking that we can accomplish a lot more than what we can do in reality. It's too easy, and it's common for people to defy history. What has happened in the past could happen in the future, and as you see on the bottom of the screen, a famous philosopher once wisely stated that we learn from history that we do not learn from history. I gave C a thumbs up too, because it's also true. There probably can't be degrees of truth, but if there was, this one would be the truest of the three. It's probably the most important. Just like I explained in the previous slide, assumptions are necessary to complete the what could go wrong or what will happen if it does go wrong cause-effect relationship that's represented in the logic of the log frame. Finally, on letter D, expecting the planned activities to produce results is also true. I'm going to call it perhaps the truest of all four. I know I said that about number 3 as well. In other words, a set of activities must produce an output. A set of outputs must contribute to an outcome, and so on. Now, let's explore the definition of assumption. I want to start by reminding you what it says in the PMD Pro Guide. Assumptions are hypotheses about necessary conditions, or sometimes we say well-educated guesses, both internal and external conditions identified in a design to ensure that the presumed cause and effect relationships function as expected and that planned activities will produce expected results. I underlined those particular parts because they line up with the answers that you were looking at in the previous question. And the picture on this slide tells a relevant story. A drop of water hitting a pool of water by itself isn't very significant, but that single drop of water creates a ripple that will go throughout the whole pond. Assumptions, while prepared to complete the logic in the identification and design phase, are important throughout all of the project phases. Before I provide my own reflections, think about this question. Why are assumptions so important in project management? I'll pause a bit here while you reflect. Here are some of my thoughts. First of all, assumptions complete the logical flow of the log frame. I hope I've made that point very clear when I talked about the earlier slides. Secondly, if the assumptions are weak, they force improvement of the objectives and strengthen the proposed project plan overall. As you look at the assumptions in a log frame, it's a possibility that you might come to the conclusion that the objectives have to be changed because they're not logical. It could be that the assumptions are killer assumptions. You may need to either change the objectives or kill the projects overall because they're going to be fatal. So likely to happen during implementation that killing the project will be better than moving forward. Thirdly, assumptions are the beginning of recognizing the risk that must be effectively managed by the manager and the team. You'll learn more about that in another PM Tools video on risk. Finally, those who provide resources, especially donors, insist that their funds be used in a manner so that the final result is more than the sum of the inputs, activities, and outputs. So in other words, they want more than 1 + 1 = 2. They want you to produce outputs, but they want outputs to result in broader, longer term, and sustainable impacts. They want 1 + 1 to = 3 or more. Here's another question. What are some of the assumptions in your work or your projects? And I'll pause again while you reflect. Here are some that arise from my experience. Of course, weather is very unpredictable. Stability, socially and politically, is extremely important. Having funding and making sure that the funding is maintained over the period of the project as was promised is important, especially in projects where you have commodities that you're producing. You need stable markets. Markets can also affect inputs as well. Exchange rates are extremely important, especially where there's fluctuation because of inflation or deflation. Participation is a huge matter for NGOs in particular because they want to ensure ownership and sustainability of projects. Corruption is often an issue that needs to be faced, and it's true in most places. The human resource side can be a huge concern. We have to assume that we can find qualified staff and that they can be hired under the terms that were specified. Then staff need to be retained for the period of project if possible. Working with partners, finding those partners and then building or helping to strengthen their capacities and their ability to manage projects. Compatible rules and regulations are important, particularly those from cooperating governments. Then, especially for those projects that involve capacity building and training, trying to assure that learning will not just stay in the classroom, but that we will get transfer of learning and get a difference in performance. While often hard to measure, leadership is extremely important, not just internally within your own project and organization, but at the donor level and also at the community and stakeholder level. Finally, good financial systems must be in place. And we could add to this chart procurement, computers, fleets. Hopefully these are some of the assumptions that you came up with in your own reflections. According to Stephen Brookfield, he calls this whole area critical thinking, which is what I think is the foundation of the logical framework or log frame. Brookfield says that critical thinking involves these 4 steps. First of all, number 1, hunting assumptions. Pretty much every action we take is based on assumptions that we have accepted, sometimes unthinkingly, as accurate. Critical thinking involves deliberately trying to find out what these assumptions are. Secondly, checking those assumptions, trying to assess whether or not our assumptions are valid and reliable, and that they can be used as a guide for action. Here, we're trying to see when assumptions make sense and when they don't. Number 3 then is seeing things from different viewpoints. One of the best ways to decide whether or not an assumption is accurate or under what conditions it does and doesn't make sense is to try and see those assumptions and actions from multiple and different points of view. And finally, number 4, taking action. The whole point of critical thinking is to do something. The reason we do the first 3 things listed on this slide is so that we don't waste energy acting in ways that we think are good and that we believe will have the effects we want, only to find out that the opposite is true. In conclusion, I will have to ask you one more question. When an assumption is turned into a negative, does it become a risk? Thumbs up or thumbs down? I'll pause while you think about this question. In my experience, the answer to that question is clearly a yes. The project manager can turn almost every assumption into a negative and use them to populate the risk register, or at least to start the population of the risk register, and that's something that will be covered in more detail in another PM Tools video. Look at the list of assumptions that we had a couple slides earlier that I've put up here again. If you turn each of these into a negative, they will become risks. Doesn't it then be illogical that managers and teams should consider these prior to the startup of implementation, and of course again during the decision gates, as we will discuss in the project management video on risk later on. This concludes the video on the topic of assumptions as a project management tool. If anything was not clear, then refer back to the PMD Pro guide. If further clarification or help is needed, then be sure to seek out those within your organization and networks who have the advanced knowledge and experience. And most importantly, continue to become more and more of self-directed and lifelong learners.